Inside a mountain cabin in Wyoming, John Walker, a veteran with a leg crippled by shrapnel, sat beside the fireplace, his mind pulled back to the flood from 30 years ago, when he saved the life of a young boy. Now that boy Daniel had returned, carrying a scar and a shattering accusation. His father had not died in an accident, but because of a buried secret. Who had stood behind that tragedy? And why had the truth been kept hidden for 3 decades? The smell of damp wood and the faint trace of burned firewood lingered in the small mountain cabin. John Walker, an American veteran who had once fought in the Middle East and carried both battlefield memories and a damaged leg from shrapnel, sat in an old wooden chair, his back pressed against the worn frame, one hand resting on a cane, the other holding a cup of steaming coffee. Outside, the autumn wind from the Wyoming mountains howled through the cracks of the door. The weak yellow light fell across his calloused hands, marked with pale scars, silent proof of a soldier's life already spent. Yet in that quiet moment, his thoughts were not fixed on some faraway battlefield. They turned back to a stormy morning nearly 30 years ago, when he had fought the river itself to pull a boy from the flood. On that day, the sky cracked open with thunder, and rain poured down on the town like a waterfall. John, only in his early 20s, had just returned from training, still uneasy with peace, his ears still carrying the echo of rifles. But when he heard the cries for help rising from the riverbank, he ran without thinking. His boots filled with water, his shirt clung cold against his skin, but he did not stop. In the whirl of the current, a small hand flailed in desperation. That boy Daniel was only 7 years old, his face streaked with mud, his wide eyes drowning in fear. The water rose higher, carrying broken planks, tree limbs, even metal roofing torn from houses. John threw himself into the torrent, the freezing water cutting into him like 1,000 tiny knives. He forced himself forward, lungs burning, arms stretched out. The boy screamed, lips purple, hands grabbing for anything that might float by. In that instant, John's training and instinct fused into one. He shouted, his voice hoarse, "Take my hand!" And with the last of his strength, Daniel seized it. The current dragged them under, mud swallowing their faces. John felt his body ripping apart, his chest on fire for air, but he would not let go. With one last kick, he forced them up, slamming against the gravel bank. They rolled onto the wet grass, coughing and choking. Amid the chaos of the storm, the boy's heartbeat returned faint but steady. John tore off his soaked jacket, wrapped it around the small frame, and held the boy close for warmth. Through the roar of the storm, he whispered to himself more than to the child, "You will live. You must live." That picture burned itself into his memory. Years later, he could still feel the boy's trembling breath against his chest, could still hear the river raging like artillery on another battlefield. It was more than saving a life. It was the moment John found meaning in a life too full of blood and gunfire. From that day on, he told himself that maybe God had spared him on the battlefield, only for this to keep another soul alive. In the glow of the fire, John's eyes carried something rare warmth mixed with gratitude. He knew that among all the sins and losses, that memory was the one thing that allowed him to face the mirror each morning. The town had long forgotten the day of the flood, but John never had. And sometimes, when his sleep was broken by the nightmares of war, he found a measure of peace by reminding himself, "You saved one life, just one, but it was enough." He sat quietly in the cabin, listening to the wind rattle the branches against the roof, as the memory replayed like an old reel of film. John Walker, a soldier who had endured more than his share of loss, held on to one treasure, that rain-soaked embrace in the storm. And he had no way of knowing that the very boy from that memory would one day return, carrying a secret buried for nearly 30 years, pulling him into another battle, one of truth and shadows. Afternoons in Wyoming always seemed to move slower, the golden light spilling across the hillsides, flickering through the whispering pines. John Walker was splitting firewood in the yard, the sharp crack of the axe biting into dry logs echoing like strong but lonely notes. He paused, sweat mixing with wood dust across his brow, when the low hum of an unfamiliar engine rolled up from the dirt road that led to his cabin. That road rarely saw visitors. He squinted into the glare of the sun, his old eyes narrowing against the light, and then the outline of a faded pickup came into view, creeping closer. The truck door opened, and a man stepped out. He stood still for a moment, as though gathering himself, weighing something heavy. John leaned on the handle of his axe, watching. The man's gait carried a faint limp, his face tanned by hard years, and immediately John noticed the thin scar tracing down the left side of his jaw, pale in the waning light. When he raised his head, his eyes locked onto John's eyes, heavy with years of buried memory. A chill swept down John's spine. There was something familiar in that look, something he could not yet name. "Mr. Walker?" The stranger's voice was rough, worn down by time. John gave a slow nod, letting the axe fall to the ground. "That's me. Who are you?" The man drew a deep breath, bracing for something that weighed on him. "My name is Daniel. Daniel Reyes." The name struck John's mind like a blade. For an instant, he was back in the floodwaters, a small hand clutching his own in the whirlpool, gasping breaths, a frantic child's heartbeat pounding against him. Nearly 3 decades had passed, yet the memory stood as sharp as yesterday. John took one step forward, his chest tightening. The boy, from the flood that day? Daniel nodded, the corner of his mouth trembling, as if confessing a truth long held. The two stood facing each other, silence thick around them. Only the wind through the pines stretched out the moment. John's throat tightened. He was not a man given easily to emotion, yet seeing the grown man before him, he felt a rush of realization. What he had done all those years ago had not vanished into the dark. Daniel had survived, carried the mark of the flood, and returned now as living proof of the one thing John had always believed was right. He brought Daniel inside the cabin. The fire in the hearth cracked softly, shadows gathering at the windows as night crept in. They sat across from each other, the table between them bare except for a pot of black coffee steaming gently. Daniel shrugged off his jacket, revealing a jagged scar down his arm, his eyes fixed on the scratched wood grain of the table. "I've thought about that day more times than I can count," Daniel said quietly. "If it weren't for you, I would have drowned with my father. He never made it out." John went still. Fragments of memory rushed back, the screams swallowed by water, the shapes of those he could not save. Daniel lifted his gaze, speaking slowly, each word heavy. "I don't believe my father died because of the flood. Someone pushed him toward it, and I found signs. Everything points to Victor Hale." The name dropped into the cabin like iron. John had heard it before, had seen Victor, the man who had built his wealth on land schemes, dams, and real estate. A name reeking of power and menace. John frowned, leaning back in his chair studying Daniel. In the young man's eyes he saw something burning, yet tempered with doubt. "You're certain? Your father was killed?" John's voice was low. Daniel's hand gripped the hot coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. "I've carried this truth for years." He covered it up, "but there are papers and stories that were forced into silence. I came back because I believe you're the only one who can understand. You pulled me out of the flood, and now I need you to pull me out of another kind of darkness." John did not answer. The small cabin filled with the distant song of the wind against the eaves. Inside him rose a mixture of shock, sorrow, and annoying curiosity. The flood had bound him to that boy's life, and now it led him toward another truth, one of betrayal, injustice, and a powerful man who had never been unmasked. That night, the hearth burned red, but John's spirit drifted in the cold space between past and present. Across from him sat Daniel, the child he had once cradled against the storm, now returned with scars, and an accusation that cut deep. His father had been murdered, and the name Victor Hale, spoken aloud at last, tolled like a bell, marking the beginning of another war, a war of truth against shadows. The night wind slipped through the cracks of the cabin, carrying with it a sharp chill and the whisper of pine needles brushing against one another. John Walker sat in his old chair, eyes fixed on the fire that was burning down to embers. Across from him, Daniel sat rigid, hands clasped tight, his gaze flickering between light and shadow in the fire's glow. The air between them felt as heavy as the cabin's rain-soaked timbers. John tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest before asking slowly, "You just said your father didn't die because of the flood, but because someone wanted him gone. What exactly do you mean?" Daniel drew in a long breath, his eyes locked on John's as though it was John himself who needed to hear this more than anyone else. "My father was an engineer in charge of the reservoir. He knew how the floodgates worked, where the structure was weak. Back then he wrote a report warning that if the valves were opened the wrong way, the pressure would destroy the riverbank. That report vanished. In its place, they filed a version that said he was careless. He died in the flood, and the file was closed as an accident. But I found his original draft hidden away in a box my mother had kept, and the approving signature on the fake report. It belongs to Victor Hale." John listened, his face tightening. He was familiar with stories that surfaced after decades, where every detail was bent by pain and fragmented memory. Rubbing his forehead, he said carefully, "Daniel, it has been nearly 30 years. Memory isn't always reliable. And Hale, he's wealthy, powerful. If the evidence was real, why hasn't anyone spoken up?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but edged with anger. "Because they're afraid. He bought them. He threatened them. But I carry this scar, and I remember. My father shouted my name before he went under. I saw Victor's eyes. He was on the bank, watching. Those weren't the eyes of a man powerless to help. They were the eyes of someone who had already decided." John's breath quickened. He could not dismiss the pain in Daniel's words, but the soldier's mind in him resisted believing an accusation without proof. The firelight carved deep lines across his face, scars of another battlefield. "You might be mistaken. I'm not saying you're lying, but sometimes we only see what we want to see," he said, his tone steady but unyielding. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the pop of burning wood. Daniel turned his face aside, jaw clenched tight. He knew doubt was natural, but it still carved the gap deeper. John reached for his coffee, but his hand froze midair. In his mind he saw again the trembling boy he had pulled from the river so long ago. He had saved Daniel once. Could he now turn his back on a second plea for help? "You said you have the original draft?" John asked, after a long pause. Daniel nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Yes, I'll show it to you. But that's not all. There's someone else, A man who worked under my father. I heard he's still in town, but he's kept silent for years. John leaned back, his chest heavy. His training had taught him to treat every piece of intelligence with suspicion, to weigh truth against traps. Yet his heart pulled in another direction. If he didn't at least look, the guilt would follow him. He remembered the battlefield nights when ignoring a small lead had cost men their lives. If he ignored Daniel now, was he letting the truth drown? Outside, the wind rose, drumming against the cabin walls. John stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the valley swallowed in darkness. The town lay quiet, scattered house lights glowing like faint stars pushing back the night. The unease in his chest grew heavier. Part of him longed to protect the peace of his old age. Another part was already being dragged back into the undertow of secrets. Turning back, he looked at Daniel. "All right," John said quietly but firmly. "I'll look at what you have. But remember, I promise nothing. If I think it's not enough, I'll walk away." Daniel nodded quickly, as though all he needed was that sliver of light breaking through the wall. In the small cabin, the fire dimmed, but the tension flared. John's doubt lingered, yet he had already stepped into the terrain of suspicion. And once a man steps onto that ground, he knows there's no easy path back. The morning sky over the town was heavy with grey clouds, the main street still wet from the night's rain. John Walker drove his battered pickup, the tires crunching over loose gravel, while Daniel sat rigid in the passenger seat, his hand clamped so tightly on the old folder that his knuckles had turned white. They said little, the cab filled only with the hum of the engine, and the steady rush of wind slipping through the cracked window. John glanced at the mirror. Daniel's face was taut, his eyes betraying both urgency and a quiet fear. As for John, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, a mixture of doubt, anger, and the sense of a storm ahead. At the end of the street rose the office building of Victor Hale, its glass walls gleaming, mirroring the swollen clouds above. It stood in stark contrast to John's weathered wooden cabin. This place radiated cold power, the kind built on money and fear. They entered the lobby. The floor was black granite polished to a shine, the overhead lights harsh and unyielding, and at the reception desk a young woman in a black suit watched them with suspicion. When she heard the name Victor Hale, she frowned slightly, then lifted the phone. Minutes later, they were escorted to the top floor. The polished door swung open. The office was vast, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the whole town below. Behind a broad walnut desk sat Victor Hale himself. He wore a grey suit, his hair combed perfectly, his eyes sharp with the habit of command. The smile on his face was not welcome, but mockery. "John Walker, and the boy from all those years ago," Victor said, his voice warm in tone yet cold in intent, each word like a blade. Daniel stiffened, then stepped forward and laid the folder on the desk. "You know my father did not die in an accident. You signed the false report, turned him into the one at fault. I want an explanation." His voice shook, but the words were firm. Victor did not even glance at the papers. He leaned back, chuckled softly. "So the boy still clings to his fantasy after nearly 30 years. Your father died because he was a fool who didn't understand the water. I saved this town by closing that chapter, and now you come here, looking for justice?" Heat surged to John's face. He knew men like this, commanders in war who treated soldiers like pawns, who buried mistakes with signatures. He remembered the scornful eyes of a superior in Iraq, when John's brothers in arms were left behind, forgotten. That same burn of humiliation rose now. His grip tightened on the cane, but he kept his voice steady. "This man lost his father to the flood. He deserves the truth. You owe him that respect." Victor leaned across the desk, his false smile gone, his face hardened. "And who do you think you are, John? A crippled veteran rotting in a wooden shack? I built this town. Without me, it would have been nothing but dust. And you," he turned to Daniel, voice dripping contempt, "you're just a child who survived by chance. Don't dream of dragging me down with your father." The words struck like a blow. Daniel's face went pale, his eyes blazed, his lips trembled. John's hand clamped on his shoulder to steady him, but inside John's chest the anger roared, pressing against his ribs. Every muscle tensed. He wanted to shout, to smash the walnut desk in half. But war had taught him. Some battles lost to rage are lost before they begin. Victor flicked his hand as though sweeping away dust. "Get out, now. I have no time for ghosts." Two security men entered, standing at the door. They didn't need to lift a hand. Victor's gaze alone was enough to remind them of their powerlessness. John helped Daniel to his feet. They walked out under Victor's steel-hard stare. The door clicked shut behind them, the sound like a final period closing a sentence of insult. Their steps echoed heavy down the long corridor. Daniel's head was bowed, his hands shaking. John's palms sweated against the cane. He had known defeat before, but this open contempt cut deeper than any wound. By the time they reached the lobby, John stopped and turned to Daniel. "You were right," he said quietly, voice low and clenched. "He has something to hide, but we won't get it by knocking on his door. If we want the truth, we'll have to find it ourselves, quiet, where he can't see us coming." Daniel lifted his eyes. Tears still glistened, but within them a new steel had begun to shine. Outside, the rain had started again, thin drops glimmering in the light of the street lamps. John drew a deep breath, the smell of rain stirring 1,000 memories. He knew then. What had happened upstairs was only the beginning. Victor Hale was more than a name. He was the shadow that blanketed the whole town. And John, together with Daniel, though scarred by insult and humiliation, would not turn back. The night settled a thin veil of mist over the town, the moon swallowed by thick clouds, so that everything lay beneath a pale, ghostly light. From John Walker's cabin, a weak square of yellow glowed against the wooden wall, his shadow long across the planks as he bent over a table buried beneath old papers. The smell of damp pages mixed with the smoke of the hearth, reminding him of the engineer's bunkers he had once known, places where numbers and lines of ink meant life or death for an entire unit. Across from him, Daniel sat stiff, his eyes locked on each page. John turned. After the humiliating confrontation with Victor, the two men had resolved to dig into the engineering records tied to the flood. Clara, John's sister, had helped them borrow a stack of files from the town's archives. Many pages were yellowed, the ink smudged, but as John ran his finger down the columns, the instincts of a soldier who had lived too long with lies told him something was wrong. Water-level tables from the night of the flood had been crossed out and rewritten in a hand, unlike the rest. Another report bore blurred ink, the chief engineer's name, Daniel's father, erased from the signatures, replaced with a stranger's mark. "See this?" John tilted the page toward Daniel. "Someone changed it. This is how they pinned the blame on your father." Daniel leaned close, his eyes flashing with a spark of hope, yet his lips trembled. In his excitement lay a shadow of dread, as though every discovery opened a deeper pit. John leaned back, his fingers drumming against the stack. He had lived through times when forged reports had left comrades to die. In war, paper could cut sharper than any blade, killing with silence and cover-ups. That weight pressed down on him now. This time it wasn't his unit, but the town itself, and the boy he had once saved, sitting scarred before him, clinging to the idea of justice. The wind outside pressed against the cabin walls, carrying with it another sound, gravel shifting under footsteps. John looked up, eyes flicking to the window. The dark outside was thick, broken only by the restless sway of trees. His old instincts rose sharp. Someone was watching. He motioned Daniel to silence, then stood and reached for the old shotgun by the shelf. He held the barrel down, but his eyes narrowed hard. Daniel caught the change in him, and quickly snuffed the lamp. The gravel crunched again, closer. John moved slow to the window, peeled the curtain just enough. For an instant he caught the shape of a figure standing at the tree line. The person neither came forward nor left, only stood, watching. The clouds shifted and a sliver of moonlight slid through, painting a faint outline. A long coat, a hood pulled low across the face. John's grip tightened on the gun. Then, without a sound, the figure stepped back into the woods, swallowed whole as if never there. The cabin froze in silence. Daniel gasped for breath while John remained at the window, his chest rising and falling. "They know," he muttered, voice rough. "Someone doesn't want us digging." Daniel clutched the folder harder, his mind twisting. The truth had flared like a spark, only to be drowned in shadow. John set the shotgun back, lowered himself into the chair, eyes heavy with thought. He had walked into too many ambushes not to recognize this. The enemy shows itself before you're ready, which meant they were on the right path, and that danger had begun in earnest. By the fire, burning lower with each crack, the two men sat across from one another, the pile of papers between them, pages that carried both the promise of hope and the weight of fear. Outside, the darkness thickened, the pine trees whispering like a warning. John drew a long breath and knew. His cabin was no longer a refuge. It had become the starting point of a hunt for truth and for shadow, and neither he nor Daniel could turn away. The town at night felt heavier than ever. The neon lights outside the only bar on the main street flickered red and green, their glow breaking across the rain puddles in warped reflections. From inside came the thin twang of country music, tangled with the raucous laughter of drunk men. Daniel sat alone at the counter, half-empty beer can in hand, his eyes distant. These past days, the fragments of memory and the broken truth about his father's death had piled on his chest like a weight he could not shift. He hadn't come to the bar to drink his worries away, but to escape for a moment that constant sense of being watched from the dark. John had not come with him. He remained at the cabin, sifting again through the old papers. Daniel needed a little space, a chance to breathe, to line up the chaos in his mind. But it was in that space that the shadow moved. When Daniel stepped outside, the alcohol had barely touched him, but he felt the shift immediately. The street was nearly empty, a few cars scattered under the weak yellow streetlights. Then came the sound, footsteps crunching on gravel behind him, closing in fast. He turned, and before he could make sense of it, a fist smashed across his face. The world tilted. He crashed to the wet ground, blood filling his mouth with its metallic sting. Two men in hooded coats yanked him up and shoved him into a narrow alley beside the bar. Pain flared across his jaw. He fought back, but it was useless. One pinned him hard against the brick wall, while the other leaned close, his whisper colder than the night air. "Stop digging. Next time it won't just be bruises." Then a punch drove deep into his gut, knocking the air from his lungs. His vision swam black. Before leaving, one of them jammed a scrap of paper into his hand, and then they vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared. Staggering out of the alley, blood dripping from his lip onto his shirt, Daniel unfolded the note beneath the streetlight. The words scrawled in thick black marker read, "Know your place. Your father is dead. Don't let others die with him." His hand shook, a chill racing down his spine. The pain was real, but sharper still was the certainty that this was no longer guesswork. Someone, Victor's men, surely knew they were getting too close, and they meant to warn him with flesh and blood. When Daniel stumbled back into the cabin, John rose sharply from the table. His breath caught at the sight of the bruised face, the swelling jaw, the blood across his shirt. "What happened?" His voice was low but hard, his hand gripping the cane tight. Daniel dropped the note onto the table and collapsed into a chair, his breath ragged. "They found me. They want us to stop." John picked up the paper, read each word. His old eyes darkened. He knew this kind of language. It was the grammar of war, except this time the battlefield lay in the middle of a quiet town. He set the note down, opened the cabinet, and carefully wrapped Daniel's wounds. His movements were slow, steady, but his gaze was taut as a wire about to snap. "Victor has begun to strike back," John said quietly, his voice deep and heavy. "When the enemy shows his face, it means we've touched what he fears. It also means he'll do whatever it takes to bury it." Daniel sat silent, his fingers clawing at the chair until his knuckles whitened. Fear wound through him, but beneath it, the flame still burned. He lifted his eyes to John, red from pain yet lit with defiance. "I won't stop. If my father died unjustly, then Victor will not rest easy." Outside, the wind roared through the pines, darkness pressing in on the cabin. John stood still, looking out the window, sensing the unseen presence watching in the night. And he knew, from the moment Daniel was beaten in that alley, the hidden war they had stepped into was no longer a question. It had begun, and there was no turning back. Morning came with fog pressed low over the town, the sky draped in heavy sheets of cloud that seemed to push down on the grey rooftops. John Walker drove his battered pickup across the damp square, its tires rattling over loose gravel, Daniel beside him clutching his ribs where bruises had not yet faded. On John's lap rested the worn leather case carrying the papers they had combed through night after night. To him it was the frail hope that truth might finally be given a voice. Daniel's face, still marred by fresh marks of violence, betrayed both resolve and the silent tremor of fear. The town hall stood solemn, a red brick relic on the square, its steps streaked with moss and littered with dry leaves. Inside, fluorescent lights cast their cold glare across rows of benches. A few dozen were already present, councilmen, town officials, men and women whose polite smiles never reached their eyes. At the front, the mayor sat flanked by a legal advisor and a representative from the engineering board. The air was stiff with ritual, a theater meant to keep questions at bay. When John and Daniel entered, faces turned sharply, some curious, some dismissive, some already mocking. John stepped to the podium, set down the leather case, and opened the stack of papers. His voice came slow and firm, like a hammer falling on a wooden table. "Gentlemen, nearly 30 years ago, on the night of the flood, records were altered. The original report of the chief engineer father of Daniel Reyes vanished, replaced by a version that shows clear signs of forgery. This is the evidence we uncovered." He held up the sheet, marked with erasures, clumsy handwriting layered over the numbers, the water-level table rewritten by another hand. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then a legal advisor sprang up, his voice high and sharp. "Council members, these documents have no value. They are past the statute of storage, damaged, lacking any forensic authentication. They are meaningless scraps." Another official tapped his pen against the desk and added, "Mr. Walker, we appreciate your concern, but what you bring us are faded pages, not evidence. The town cannot waste its time reopening what was settled 3 decades ago." End of 40. Daniel shot to his feet, his voice breaking with anger. "My father did not die from negligence. You know this. Someone buried the truth." But his words were drowned in derisive laughter. One councilman sneered, "Young man, grief is no excuse for conspiracy. Without proper proof, your story is nothing but rubbish." John's hand dug into the edge of the podium, his nails biting the wood. He saw in their eyes the same cold indifference he had once seen in officers who treated soldiers' lives as expendable pieces. Sweat rolled down his brow, yet his voice stayed level, restrained. "You can dismiss me, but this boy survived that night. His father died trying to warn you. At the very least, you owe the truth a chance." The mayor's gavel struck hard. "Enough. These files are inadmissible. This matter is closed." The sound echoed like a door slamming shut. Daniel collapsed into his chair, his hands trembling violently. John stood rigid, his throat thick, his chest constricted by a fury that could find no words. All the hope they had carried into this morning lay crushed beneath a single phrase, inadmissible. When they stepped outside, the daylight was blinding. Through the haze, John caught sight of Victor Hale standing in the distance, leaning against his polished car, his mouth curled in a thin smile. That look of arrogance sent fire through John's blood, but he held himself still. Rage alone would only hand them defeat. Daniel walked beside him, Eyes wet, voice raw. Everything is against us. They'll never listen. John laid a hand on his shoulder, firm. If the front door is locked, then we find another way in. And in that moment one name rose in his mind. Clara, his sister, the woman who had once worked at the local paper. Driving back through the fog, John gripped the wheel tight, eyes set deep in thought. If the council chose to bury the truth, then only daylight, the kind carried by the press, could burn through the dark. To unmask a man like Victor Hale, they would need more than evidence. They would need to put it before the people, and Clara was the first person John trusted to strike that spark. News traveled faster than the mountain wind. Just one day after the hearing at Town Hall, the small town was already humming with whispers. When John Walker stepped into the corner grocery to buy a few supplies, he sensed the change instantly. The old shopkeeper, who had greeted him kindly for years, now avoided his eyes, silently ringing up the goods. Across the aisle, two women bent their heads together, glanced toward him, then turned quickly away. As John stepped out, the wind cut down the narrow street, carrying with it a voice loud enough for him to catch. That old soldier hurt men in the war. A man like that only brings trouble. He froze, his hand clamping the paper bag until it crackled under the strain. Rage surged hot in his blood, but he swallowed it, forcing it down his throat. The air around him was thick, suffocating, familiar, like the weight of suspicion he had once felt from his own brothers in arms after a firefight twisted by rumor. The shame he thought buried by time was now dragged back into the open, weaponized by a man he knew too well, Victor Hale. By late afternoon, Clara arrived at the cabin. In her hand was the latest issue of the local paper. Its headline splashed bold across the front page. Veteran Walker, psychological instability from Iraq service. Below it ran a piece claiming John had once been suspended for injuring a fellow soldier during a breakdown. Clara laid the paper on the table with a weary sigh. He's made his move. He wants the whole town to see you as unstable. John picked up the paper, his eyes darkening. Memory rushed back. A night outside Fallujah, gunfire cracking, smoke choking the streets. A young soldier panicked, firing wildly, threatening the entire squad. John had tackled him hard, snapping his arm but saving the others. The report had reduced it to two damning words: inflicted injury. Later the truth was known among his unit, but the blemish remained in his file, lying dormant until now. Victor had found it, twisted it, turned it into proof that John could not be trusted. Daniel sat in the corner, fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. He wants to silence us by killing your credibility. If people believe you're unstable, then everything we say about the flood becomes worthless. John swallowed hard. He felt not only the truth choking under Victor's grip, but also his own honor he had bled for, sweated for, lost friends for, now trampled before the eyes of his neighbors. That night, John sat alone on the porch, a bottle of whiskey glinting in his hand. The wind blew cold through the pines, carrying the buzz of insects and the sharp scent of resin. He drank, the burn cutting down into his chest. The years of war poured back the faces of fallen men, the urgent crackle of the radio, the blank stares of officers when he tried to defend himself. The feeling of stolen dignity came back sharper than before, because this time it wasn't only him. Daniel, the boy he had once carried out of the flood, was now staking his belief on him. Clara came out, wrapped in a shawl, and sat beside him. He's striking at your weakest point, but we can't let him win. We have to make people see him for what he is. John lifted his eyes, red and raw, his voice hoarse but steady. I endured war. I endured loss. But no man has the right to call me insane. No one. In the smoldering fire of his anger, John felt the spark of resolve take hold. Victor had money, Victor had power, but there was one thing he did not have: the truth. And that truth, though buried in dust and lies, was still there. John would drag it into the light, not only to clear Daniel's father's name, but to reclaim his own honor, the honor of a soldier who had once chosen the right path in the flood, and who would choose it again. The forest was too quiet that night, only the thin chirp of insects and the sigh of wind slipping through the heavy pine canopy. John Walker had dozed off in the armchair, while Daniel lay on the couch, his face still marked with bruises that hadn't yet faded. The fire in the hearth had burned down to dull coals, their red glow casting faint shadows on the wooden ceiling. Then it came a small pop outside on the porch, followed by the acrid smell of gasoline catching flame. Seconds later, the cabin windows flared orange. Fire leapt upward, as if someone had poured an entire can of fuel along the walls. John jerked awake, his heart hammering. Glass shattered, and a flaming bottle rolled across the floor, a homemade firebomb. The blaze raced like a wild animal, climbing the dry timber walls. Daniel shot up, coughing, choking as thick smoke coiled through the room. God! He gasped, panic rising in his voice. John tore a blanket from the chair and beat down the flames, but every slap only brought new tongues of fire clawing higher. The little cabin turned into a wooden trap. Heat pressed hard, smoke seared his eyes. Grabbing Daniel by the shoulders, John pulled him toward the door, only to find the porch beam collapsed in a sheet of sparks, blocking the way out. Fire surged on all sides. Wind funneled in, feeding the blaze until it roared like artillery shells bursting overhead. His throat burned raw, his chest seized. For an instant he was back on the battlefield, a bunker hit, flames pouring down, comrades screaming in the dark. The memory of death, close and merciless, wrapped him again. Daniel staggered, hacking, eyes streaming. We're not getting out," he rasped before dropping to the floor, flames licking the carpet. John seized his arm, shouting through the smoke, "Get up, we're not dead yet." He dragged him toward the back window, grabbed a wooden chair, and heaved it hard. Glass exploded outward, shards raining down as cold night air rushed in, and with it, the fire flared hotter. No time left. Wrapping his arm in his jacket, John swept the remaining glass clear and shoved Daniel through. The boy tumbled into the dirt outside, coughing, clothes charred with smoke. John clambered after him, his shoulder scraping the burning frame, the stench of scorched flesh forcing his teeth tight. He hit the damp ground, rolled through dry leaves until the chill of earth cooled the fire on his skin. They lay gasping in the dark, eyes fixed on the cabin as it turned into a torch, beams cracking and walls collapsing under the flames. Daniel pushed himself upright, coughing hard, tears streaking his ash-stained face. He really means to kill us," he said, voice shaking. John leaned on his cane, sweat and soot streaking his features, his eyes burning with fury. This wasn't a warning. Victor had declared open war, fire as his weapon, meant to erase them along with every scrap of evidence. Then Daniel's face changed, a flicker of memory breaking through. There's something my father buried, a metal box, in the yard of our old house. I forgot, but just now, I remembered him saying, if anything ever happened, to find it." His voice trembled, but in his eyes glimmered the first trace of hope amid the acrid night. John studied him, his own heartbeat slowing as the rage cooled into something sharper. A box hidden long ago, by the very man Victor had tried to erase. Inside there might be proof, maybe only relics, but after losing his home to fire, any lead was salvation. He gripped Daniel's shoulder, his weathered hand firm. "Then we'll find it. If your father left us anything, that's what Victor fears most." They sat in the dark clearing. Behind them the cabin burned hot and loud, painting the pines in blood-red light. The air was thick with ash and smoke, but in their eyes fear had given way to something else, anger hardened to steel, and a fragile hope bound to a buried metal box waiting to be unearthed. That night, after the fire had swallowed the cabin whole, John and Daniel could not close their eyes. They took shelter in Clara's old barn, the weak flame of a kerosene lamp trembling across faces blackened with soot. The smell of smoke clung stubbornly to their clothes and hair, every breath still sharp with ash. Yet inside both men another fire burned, hotter rage, and the hard resolve to find the box Daniel had remembered. By morning they walked out onto the abandoned lot where Daniel's childhood home had once stood. Weeds rose to their knees, tangling with rotted beams and the remnants of a life long gone. The house was nothing more than a scar on the ground now, its foundation cracked and lost. Daniel stood still for a long moment, his eyes wet, before stepping silently toward the old oak at the back of the yard. He remembered his father's words, spoken when he was too young to understand. "If the day ever comes when you must know the truth, look beneath the roots." John took up the shovel, and together they dug. The soil was damp, heavy with the smell of rot. Sweat streaked their faces, but neither stopped. Then the blade struck something solid. Daniel dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt until an old metal box emerged, edges rusted, lock corroded. His hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside lay faded family photographs, and a thick envelope sealed, scrawled across in a rough hand. "To my son, if I am gone." Daniel opened it carefully. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting uneven but strong. His voice broke as he read aloud. "Daniel, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. Know this, the flood was no accident. I reported the danger many times, but Victor Hale gave the order to open the gates the wrong way, at the peak of the storm, to protect his projects downstream. Dozens died because of that decision. I knew if I kept resisting, they would silence me. But I do not regret it. The truth must be kept. Find those who will listen, and do not be afraid. Justice may be slow, but it will come." Daniel's hands shook, tears falling onto the page. Each line cut into him like a blade, grief and fury bound together. The father he had once admired, stern but kind, stood before him again in these words, not as a victim of carelessness but as a man who had died, standing against power. John said nothing at first, his eyes fixed on the letter, his chest tight with rising anger. War had taught him to live with loss, but this was different. This was not stray bullets or blind chance, this was murder hidden under paper and signatures. He laid a calloused hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice rough. "Your father chose to keep the truth. Now it's in our hands. That makes it a blood oath." Daniel nodded, tears streaked with dust and ash across his face. Yet in his reddened eyes flickered something more than grief, a spark of hope. The letter was the first proof no one could deny. It cleared his father's name and pointed directly at Victor Hale, as the man behind the deaths. John folded the letter with care and tucked it into his coat. Looking out across the barren lot, he watched the grass bow low under the push of the wind, as though the land itself carried the weight of the secret now revealed. In that moment he saw the road ahead with clarity, This was no longer about clearing one man's honor. It was about a town, about lives lost in the torrent, and this time, they were not alone. They had the father's letter, they had the truth, and they had the fire still burning in the heart of a soldier. The mountain wind swept down through the night, curling across the empty fields where John Walker and Daniel had unearthed the metal box. Back at Clara's spare cabin, the dim glow of a kerosene lamp cast wavering light over their smoke-stained faces. The father's letter lay neatly on the table beside a cup of coffee gone cold. Neither man spoke for a long time, only the pop of burning wood filled the silence. John sat upright, his weathered hands cupped as if holding a vow. In his deep eyes there was no hesitation now, only iron resolve. "We are not burying this letter," John said, his voice hoarse but unflinching. "Your father gave his life to guard the truth. If we keep silent, Victor wins forever. I swear we'll drag this into the light, even if it means standing against the whole town." The words landed like hammer blows, shaking the small room with an invisible weight. Daniel raised his head, his bruised face lined with fear. "But can't you see, John?" His voice trembled, though his gaze did not falter. "The deeper we dig, the harder he strikes. The cabin's gone. I barely survived the alley. He's got money, men, and the council in his pocket. If we go on, we'll have nothing left." The words sliced the air, voicing the dread Daniel had tried to bury. John drew a steady breath, eyes fixed on him. "You're right. The danger is here, close enough to feel it, but I've lived through days where one backward step meant leaving bodies in the dirt. Fear is real, but if you let it steer you, you're dead already. Daniel, your father wrote this letter for you because he believed you'd have the courage to keep it alive. I'm not here to replace him. I'm here to stand with you, to finish what he started." Daniel bent his head, his hand resting on the brittle envelope, his finger trembling along its edge. Tears fell, but not only for grief. In the weight of John's words, he felt something else, that he wasn't alone. The fire in the hearth leapt higher, carving their faces in light. The old soldier scarred by war, the young man scarred by legacy. 2 generations, 2 wounds, now forged into one will. Clara entered quietly, a kettle of hot water in her hands. She set it down, studied them both, and gave a slow nod. "You've chosen, haven't you?" John answered with nothing but a look. She sighed. "Then I'll help. I know a few reporters who still care about the truth. If we give them the letter, we can at least plant a seed of doubt. Victor can't silence everyone." Daniel's eyes lifted, a flicker of light breaking through the haze. If the press takes it up, maybe the truth will have a chance. Yet his fear returned, dragging his voice low. "And if he strikes first?" John pressed a calloused hand to his shoulder, firm and steady. "Then we stand tall. It's the only way forward." Outside, the wind screamed through the pines, but in the cabin the fire of belief had caught flame, fragile, but alive. John felt purpose stirring in him again, not for medals or parades, but for justice owed a dead man, for his own honor, and for a town drowning in shadow. That night, before dousing the lamp, John scratched a few words into his notebook. "If I fall, Daniel will carry this letter forward. We cannot be silent." He closed the book, eyes on the dying embers, a vow echoing in his chest. Across the table, Daniel sat motionless, his gaze no longer bound by fear alone, but lit by the faint spark of will that had just been passed to him. The thin crescent moon hung behind a veil of clouds, its pale light spilling over the dirt road that led to the old wooden bridge spanning the narrow river. The sound of water slapping against rocks below mixed with the hum of night insects, a setting that looked calm but carried danger beneath it. John steered the battered pickup slowly, his eyes fixed on the black ahead, while Daniel sat stiff beside him, clutching tight the bag that held his father's letter. Each crunch of gravel under the tires pressed heavier on their chests. Halfway across the bridge, John felt it, not the wind, but the absence of it. The forest had gone silent, as if every living thing had vanished. His soldier's instinct screamed. A second later, headlights blasted to life at both ends of the bridge. Engines roared, splitting the night. From the shadows came 4 broad-shouldered men in leather coats, chains and iron bars glinting in their hands, eyes cold. "Out of the truck, old man," a gravelly voice ordered. John tightened his grip on the wheel, but knew escape was impossible. He signaled Daniel to stay quiet, then opened the door, his cane tapping on the wood planks. Daniel followed, heart pounding, staring at the hard faces closing in. The biggest of them stepped forward, cigarette tip glowing red. "Victor sends his regards. You should have stayed in the woods, drinking yourself into nothing. Too late for that now." He swung his iron bar, smashing John's side. Pain shot through his hip and leg. The cane clattered away. Daniel shouted and lunged, but another thug drove an elbow into his gut, folding him to the ground. John crumpled onto the boards, blood streaking his knee, but his eyes blazed. Laughter circled them, the clang of iron bars against the railing like a funeral drum. For a flash he was back in combat, surrounded, smoke and blood choking the air. The pain did not paralyze him, it pulled the survivor out of him. "Daniel, down!" he barked. He snatched up a fistful of gravel from the bridge and hurled it into a headlight. The bulb burst, plunging half the bridge into darkness. The men faltered. John drove his shoulder into the nearest thug, shoving him over the railing. The scream faded into the river below. Blood ran hot down John's leg, but he didn't stop. Another rushed him with a chain. John caught it, twisted, and yanked the man off balance. Daniel, scrambling up, grabbed a broken plank and swung wildly at the one who held him, breaking free. He staggered back toward John. They retreated step by step toward the railing, fury and fear pounding in their ears like war drums. "We have to jump," John roared, sweat and blood streaking his face. Daniel froze, staring at the river swirling black beneath them. "We'll drown. Trust me." John's voice tore through the night. He seized Daniel's hand and hurled them both over the side. The plunge was a blur of wind and noise, the shouts above shrinking. Then the river swallowed them whole. The water was knives, stabbing cold, hammering breath from their lungs. John's wounds seared, his chest ready to explode, but he clamped Daniel against him and kicked hard with his good leg until they broke the surface, gasping. Behind them the men cursed and shouted from the bridge. John and Daniel let the current take them, away from the beams of light, away from the growl of engines. Darkness closed around them, icy and vast. John's mind held to a single truth. He had kept Daniel alive one more time, and in that act, the fight with Victor Hale had crossed the line. There was no turning back. 2 days after the ambush on the old bridge, John Walker and Daniel still carried their wounds. John's torn leg made every step a limp, while Daniel's body was marked in bruises. Yet neither spoke of retreat. If anything, their resolve hardened. They hid in the cramped back room of Clara's store, moving only under the cover of darkness, keeping clear of the town's stairs and the sharp edge of rumor now cutting through every street. Daniel could not sleep. His father's face, the raging flood, the fists and chains on the bridge, they tangled in his head like shards he couldn't piece together. One afternoon, rummaging again through the old metal box, he found something wedged flat at the bottom, a small notebook, its leather cover cracked, its edges caked with soil. Inside, page after page bore hand-drawn lines, figures, and symbols. He froze at a particular sheet, a map of the dam, each sluice gate marked with care, red arrows stabbing across the page. His heart thumped as he rushed to John, who was propping up his leg in the lamp's dim glow. "John, look at this." He laid the book on the table. John leaned close, sliding on his reading glasses, tracing the faded ink with a soldier's focus. The diagram was exact, each gate numbered. Beside it, in Daniel's father's scrawled hand, were the words, "Wrong order opened, Gate 3, instead of Gate 5. Pressure diverted into the town. Catastrophe." The air grew tight. John drew a long breath, his fingers tapping the table's edge. This was no story told in grief, no fragile memory. This was technical proof, the kind only an insider could leave. "Daniel," he said, voice low, deliberate. "This is what we needed. No one can dismiss this as rumor. It shows Victor gave the wrong command. Dozens died because of it." Daniel swallowed, his chest surging with pride and dread all at once. At last, his father's name was cleared, but the weight of the page pressed like stone now he knew how dangerous it was. "If he learns we have this..." His words broke off, but both men knew. Victor would not rest until it was ash. John sat in silence, then nodded slowly. "You'd better steel yourself. Holding proof like this makes us his sharpest thorn. But for once, we're not just fighting shadows. Do you hear it, Daniel? This is the sound of truth breathing again." His voice carried both gravity and fire. Daniel clutched the map, his eyes fixed on every red line, and in his mind he heard his father's voice. Hold the truth. For years he had lived beneath whispers of negligence, but here, at last, was a weapon against the dark. A frail but real faith took root in his chest. That night they spread the map across the table, weighing how to bring it into the light. Clara stepped in quietly, her gaze falling on their determined faces. She said little at first, then softly, "If you mean to go forward, you need to plan. I know a reporter who still has a spine. He's not one they can buy. But before we meet him, this map must vanish from sight. This isn't paper, it's the artery of the whole case." John nodded, his rough hand smoothing over the fragile sheet. "You're right. It's the strongest proof we've ever had, and the most dangerous." He folded the map with care, slid it into a cloth pouch, and pressed it into Daniel's hands. "You keep it. It's your father's legacy, and it's the spearhead of this fight." Daniel hugged the pouch to his chest, as though holding his father's spirit itself. In that moment, he ceased being only the boy haunted by the past. He became the witness, the bearer of truth. And across the table sat John the soldier, who once dragged him from a flood, now standing beside him again, to guard a piece of paper old and worn, but powerful enough to change the fate of an entire town. The morning sky sagged heavy with grey clouds, the damp smell of the river clinging to every street. John Walker had just stepped out of Clara's shop when a sleek black car slid to a stop in front of him. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, cold as stone, and thrust a thick envelope into his hands. "Summons," one said flatly before turning away. John tore it open and read the bold print. "Defendant, John Walker. Charges: property damage, unlawful trespass." His fist crumpled the paper, rage rising like fire in his chest. In his mind, the trap snapped shut. Victor wasn't just striking in shadows anymore, he was dragging the law itself down on John's head, grinding away at his honor and his freedom. Back in the dim back room, John dropped the letter on the table. Daniel's face drained white. He wants to lock you up. If this goes through, we lose everything." His voice shook with fear. Clara entered, her eyes drawn tight with worry. "Victor knows you can't afford a real lawyer. He knows your reputation is already bruised. He doesn't need the truth to win. He just needs you tangled in court. Once you're behind bars, every scrap of evidence we have will be worthless." Her words dropped like lead, thickening the air. John lowered himself into a chair, fatigue carved deep into his face. He had stared down death at the end of a rifle, but this felt different, like being strangled slow, without a chance to fight back. "He knows exactly what he's doing," he murmured, voice low and steady as wind. "He wants to break me not with bullets, but with law." Daniel paced, fists clamped. "We still have the map, we still have the letter, but if you're convicted, no one will believe it. They'll call it the ramblings of a broken old vet." He stopped, eyes blazing with fear and anger. "So what do we do? Just wait while he crushes us?" Clara folded her arms, silent for a long beat before speaking carefully. "There is someone. A man who worked the dam the year of the flood. His name vanished from the records. Nobody mentions him now, but when I was still reporting, I heard he moved out to the edge of the county, living quiet. If anyone knows the truth of that night, it's him." John's head lifted, a flicker of hope crossing his weathered face. "His name?" Clara's answer came soft but clear. "Miguel Alvarez. Folks called him Mike. He was on shift the night Victor gave the order. I don't know why his record disappeared, but if we find him, his testimony could tear Victor's whole lie apart." Daniel leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "Then we have to go. If he's alive, he's the last witness left." But John raised a hand, steadying him. "Yes, but we move careful. Victor won't let a witness walk free if he knows we're looking." He turned to Clara. "Can you find out where he is?" Clara nodded firmly. "I'll call in old favors, but it will take time. And while I work, you need to prepare for that trial. Don't let them swallow you whole without a fight." The room pressed close with silence. John felt Victor's hand tightening around him, every snare pulling closer. It was like standing in a bunker half collapsed, daylight gone. But in that darkness, the name Miguel Alvarez glowed faintly, a crack in the wall. If they could reach him, it might not all be lost. He leaned back, closed his eyes, let the pain in his leg flare sharp to remind him he was still alive, still needed. When he opened them again, the despair had burned off, leaving the steel of a soldier. "Victor wants me in a cell? Fine. But before that happens, I'll find Alvarez. And when I do, Victor will be the one standing in front of a judge." Daniel sat down beside him, nodding hard, eyes young but fierce with belief. Clara let out a breath, then clasped John's hand. For a moment, the three of them, an old soldier, a son carrying his father's shadow, and a woman who had seen too many lies, sat together in silence, the wind clawing at the shutters. They knew they were cornered. But they also knew, as long as they were breathing, there was still a chance to strike back, and that chance had a name: Miguel Alvarez. The twilight settled over the rooftops of the outskirts, painting them in bruised purple as John Walker and Daniel followed Clara's lead to the end of a dirt road. There stood Miguel Alvarez's shack, a crooked timber house, sagging like it was trying to fold into itself. When they knocked, the door cracked open, and a gaunt old man appeared, hair shot with grey, eyes wide and wild, like an animal cornered. Before they could speak, he whispered fast, voice broken, "I don't know anything. Leave now, before someone sees." John caught the door with his calloused hand, steady as stone. "Mr. Alvarez, we're not here to hurt you. You were on shift, the night of the flood. You saw what happened." Miguel's face drained pale, his lips trembled. "Yes, I saw. I heard the order from Victor. He forced the opening of Gate 3 instead of Gate 5. The water drove straight into the houses, and everything happened. I know it. But," his gaze drifted, haunted, "I stayed silent 30 years. I have family. He'll kill me if I speak." Daniel stepped forward, hands shaking but voice sharp with pain. "My father died in that water because of that order. You can't stay silent forever. The truth has to be known." Miguel's eyes softened for a heartbeat, sorrow passing through, then dropped. "I'm sorry, boy. I have a wife, a daughter. I can't." He shoved them back with trembling arms and slammed the door. They stood outside, weight heavy as stone pressing them down. John gripped his cane tight, eyes dark. "He's the link we need, but Victor has him locked in chains of fear. Unless we break those chains, we lose." Daniel said nothing, his shoulders shaking, his face empty. That night, Clara's voice crackled down the phone, shaken. "Victor made his move. Miguel's wife and daughter, they've been taken. He wants to shut Miguel up for good." The news cut like steel. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "We can't wait. If we do, he'll break for good." John rose, his eyes flashing like a blade. "Then we rescue them. This isn't about evidence anymore. It's about lives." He remembered the battlefield, the nights when you rushed into fire because leaving a man behind meant he died alone. Now he would do it again, not for comrades, but for a town drowning in lies. Clara's tip led them to an abandoned warehouse by the old rail yard. Night fell hard, the wind screaming through rusted tin. They crawled to the fence, peered through slats. Inside, 2 of Victor's men stood guard. Miguel's wife and daughter were tied to posts, eyes wide with terror. Miguel himself knelt before them, broken, mumbling apologies. John gave Daniel a sharp nod. Daniel picked up a brick and hurled it into the shadows. One guard turned to John, rushed in behind him, his cane swinging hard, cracking against the man's skull. The second pulled a knife, lunged. Daniel charged, shoulder slamming him down onto the concrete. The blade flashed, death close, but Daniel pinned the man's wrist, fury in his eyes. John stepped in, one brutal strike ending the fight. Breath rasped in the dark. Miguel collapsed around his wife and child, clutching them, sobbing. When he lifted his head to John and Daniel, his eyes had changed no longer. Only fear, but gratitude and fire. You saved them. I owe you. I won't stay silent. I'll tell it all. John hauled him up, his voice like iron. There's no turning back now. You walk with us to the end. Daniel came close, eyes wet, but lit with something new. Hope. For the first time they had more than scraps of paper and fading memories. They had a living witness willing to speak. And in that grim warehouse stinking of oil and shadow, they had pulled one man across the line from silence into the ranks of truth. That morning the town hall blazed with light, its steps crowded like never before. Word of new evidence had spread fast, drawing townsfolk, officials and reporters, with cameras flashing like bursts of lightning. Clara moved quickly at the front, ushering John, Daniel and Miguel inside. Miguel wore a worn shirt, sweat beading his brow, but his eyes no longer carried the panic of a hunted man, only the weight of what he was about to do. Inside, every seat was filled. At the high table sat the mayor and his advisors, stiff in posture, but uneasy in their eyes. Off to the right, Victor Hale appeared in a dark suit, polished and poised, a confident half-smile fixed on his face. A team of lawyers flanked him, their files stacked thick, eyes sharp as blades. When John entered, Victor tilted his head, his gaze slicing across the room like a knife, the smile never leaving. The gavel struck, the hearing opened. The mayor gave a curt preamble, then called on John. The old soldier rose, leaning on his cane, every tap against the wood floor booming like a drum. He laid the letter and the dam's original map on the table. His voice, gravelly but firm, carried through the chamber. Over 30 years ago, dozens died in the flood. The official record calls it an accident, but these papers tell another story. This is the original technical map, marked by the chief engineer Daniel Reyes' father. It shows Gate 3 was forced open instead of Gate 5, driving water into the homes of this town. He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd. And here is the witness, Miguel Alvarez, the man on duty that night. He will tell you the truth. A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall. Miguel stepped forward, his legs unsteady, but his voice clearing with each word. I worked at the dam that night. I took my orders directly from Victor Hale. He demanded Gate 3 be opened, against all procedure. I argued, but he threatened me. I saw the water tear through. I saw homes vanish. I saw lives lost. I stayed silent to protect my family. But today, I cannot be silent anymore. The words fell like nails driven deep. Gasps rose, hands covered mouths. The crowd shifted, stunned, but Victor did not flinch. He stood slowly, pointed straight at Miguel. This so-called witness is a liar. He was fired for theft. He's hated me for years. You'll believe the word of a bitter old failure over me, a man who hid in the shadows for decades, now inventing stories to smear me. His voice rang with practiced confidence. At once his lawyers produced a file, reading aloud Miguel's alleged disciplinary record. Pages of supposed infractions echoed in the chamber. The mood swayed, murmurs turning doubtful. Miguel's shoulders shook, his head dropping under the weight of shame. Daniel surged forward, ready to shout him back to courage, but John's hand shot out, stopping him. The soldier's eyes never left Victor. Victor, John thundered, his voice cutting through the noise. If you're innocent, explain this map. Explain why your signature lies on the falsified report. He held the paper high, sunlight striking across it, illuminating the jagged handwriting for all to see. For a flicker of a second, Victor's mask cracked. A shadow of tension flared in his eyes, too brief for most to catch, but John saw it. A soldier knows the twitch before a trigger pull, the blink of fear before the charge. He recognized it instantly. The chamber split down the middle. Some turned against Victor, whispering of corruption. Others clung to doubt, swayed by the lawyer's show. The mayor's gavel pounded, the hall seething like a wire stretched to breaking. Clara, at the back, flashed John a look, the signal. The reporters had captured every word, every falter, every flicker. John knew this war would not be decided here, not today. But for the first time in 30 years, the truth had broken the surface, spoken aloud where it could not be buried again. And John Walker, scarred and limping, had stood tall in front of the most powerful man in town and stared straight into his eyes without blinking. The night after the hearing, Clara's back room was drowned in silence so thick it pressed on the chest. Outside, rain tapped slow and heavy on the tin roof. John sat at the scarred table, his hand trembling as he poured more coffee into a chipped cup. Across from him, Daniel stared hollow-eyed, face gaunt as if he had staggered from a battle harsher than the morning's fight inside the hall. The lamp's yellow glow cast their faces in stark contrast, one old, scarred, holding on to calm with iron will, one young, burdened with a secret too heavy to cage any longer. John, Daniel's voice rasped, then broke off as if each word was a blade dragged across flesh. There's something I've never told anyone, but after today, I can't keep it inside. John lifted his head, suspicion tightening his gut. He gave a slow nod. "Say it." Daniel drew a breath, hands clenched to still the tremor. "Victor, he isn't only the man who killed my father." His voice fractured. "He is my real father." The room split open. John froze. The cup slipped from his grip, coffee spilling across the wood in a dark pool. For a moment the world spun, like a mortar shell exploding in the trench beside him. "What did you say?" His voice rasped, raw. Daniel bit down on his lip until blood welled. "My mother told me, before she married my father, Victor deceived her. An affair. She hid it, kept it locked in a diary I stumbled upon. I was the result of that. The man I called father raised me with love, even knowing the truth. And Victor has known all along." John sagged back, hand pressed to his forehead, a sharp pain stabbing through skull and heart alike. The smirk Victor wore in the hearing, the flash in Daniel's eyes, they collided, fusing into one unbearable image. "Lord," he whispered, breath ragged. Daniel's voice cracked as he pressed on. "Now you see why he's never struck me directly, because I'm his blood. But to him I'm also shame, a secret he'll bury alive if he must." Silence swallowed them. John's chest heaved, a storm of shock, sorrow, and confusion tearing through him. All this time he had fought believing Victor the unyielding enemy, and Daniel the son of a fallen man. Now the ground shifted. The boy he had saved, the one who stood beside him through fire and water, carried the blood of the man he despised most. He pushed up, stumbled onto the porch. Cold rain lashed his burning face. His pulse hammered as old memories surged the flood, Victor's eyes, the screams of the drowned. His fists gripped the railing until the knuckles whitened. A part of him wanted to drive Daniel away, to see in him nothing but the enemy's seed. But then he remembered the cabin burning, the ambush on the bridge, Daniel fighting shoulder to shoulder, refusing to break. Blood didn't change that. Daniel stepped into the rain, voice shaking. "If you want to leave me, I'll understand. I carry his filth. But please, don't let my father's truth be buried again. The man who raised me, he deserves his name cleared." John turned, eyes raw with fury and grief. His voice broke but held steel. "You don't choose the blood in your veins, but you do choose the path you walk, and you've chosen truth. Don't you ever forget that." And, in the rain, they stood facing each other, old and young, both bearing the weight of past and secret. The shock still burned, the hurt still raw, but beneath it flickered something that refused to die. The knowledge that, no matter how twisted the truth had become, they would not let go of the fight. The town hall that night was more packed than any session before. Word had spread like wildfire. Daniel Reyes, the boy who had survived the flood 3 decades ago, was going to speak. Cold white lights from the ceiling spilled over rows of tense, skeptical faces. Reporters crammed the front benches, cameras lifted, microphones aimed toward the podium. The air was thick, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for a bomb to detonate. Victor Hale entered in a grey suit, arrogance stitched into every step. He sat among the town officials, signaling his lawyers to stack their heavy files on the desk before him. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on John Walker, stiff in the front row, leaning on his cane, his gaze hard as steel. Beside him stood Daniel, hands trembling, but eyes blazing with resolve. When the mayor called the session open, Daniel stepped forward. The hall fell silent. He drew in a breath, voice breaking yet ringing clear. "I, Daniel Reyes, stand here to tell the truth. The man responsible for my father's death, and for the deaths of dozens in the flood, is Victor Hale." The crowd gasped, murmurs rolling like waves. But Daniel pressed on, gripping the microphone, his voice sharpening. "And there is more. Victor is not only a killer, he is my father." The hall exploded, shouts, flashes, voices colliding in chaos. All eyes snapped to Victor. His face froze, then flushed crimson. "Shut your mouth," he roared, slamming his hand onto the desk. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve in panic, but Victor shoved him off. He lurched to his feet, finger stabbing the air at Daniel, eyes wild. "You are not my son, you ungrateful wretch. I gave you life, and you dare betray me before this whole town." Daniel did not flinch. Sweat streaked his forehead, but his eyes locked on Victor, his voice rising with raw fury. "You betrayed everything before I was born. You betrayed my mother. You betrayed this town. You betrayed every soul swept away by that flood. You are no father of mine." The chamber erupted, people shouting, some leaping from their seats. Victor bellowed like a cornered beast, lunging from his bench, toppling the table, papers flying. Lawyers and guards grabbed at him, but he shoved them aside, eyes bloodshot, fists raised toward Daniel. Cameras snapped furiously, the room a storm of flash and screams. John rose instantly, his cane cracking against the floor like a rifle shot. He surged forward, planting himself between Victor and Daniel, arms spread wide. "Stop, Victor!" his voice thundered. Victor froze, panting, his face twisted with rage. "You too, Walker. You crippled old soldier," he spat, straining to break free. John stood firm, eyes blazing. "Look around you. The whole town is watching. You're not the puppeteer in the shadows anymore. You're tearing off your own mask." He pointed toward the crowd, where cameras captured every wild gesture, every unhinged snarl. The whispers turned into shouts of anger. Fear gave way to outrage as townsfolk saw Victor laid bare. The mayor's gavel pounded uselessly against the uproar. Security swarmed, finally restraining Victor as he raved and cursed, his voice breaking into incoherence. Behind John, Daniel trembled, tears brimming, yet his eyes shone with fierce clarity. He whispered, "Horse, he's destroyed himself." John turned, gripping the boy's shoulder tight. Yes, but it was you who made this happen. You stood up, no matter how painful the truth. Hold. In the chaos, shouts, curses, flashes firing like lightning, the confrontation between father and son erupted in full flame. And in Victor's unbridled fury, before the eyes of his town, came proof no court could deny. He was guilty, and worse, he was a man who had forfeited every shred of moral authority he once held. Police sirens wailed outside the town hall, blue and red lights spinning against the windows. The chamber still trembled with the echo of shouts. Victor Hale had been pinned down, his arms twisted behind him, steel cuffs biting into his wrists. His fine grey suit hung wrinkled, his tie loose, his face flushed red with rage and disgrace. He thrashed, he cursed, but every struggle only made him look more broken, more unhinged. Reporters rushed forward, cameras rolling, microphones shoved close, recording every second. From the crowd came words once whispered in fear, now shouted without hesitation. Liar. He killed them. Take him away. John stood back, cane clutched tight in his hand. For a brief instant Victor's eyes locked with his red, frantic, part hatred, part desperate plea. But it was the last flicker of a man who had lost everything. Beside John, Daniel's shoulders trembled, his young face drawn tight, but his eyes shone with fire. When the police car door slammed shut and carried Victor away, the hall erupted in a wave of voices, half relief, half disbelief. A shadow that had hung over the town for 30 years had finally cracked, and light forced its way in. At the dais, the mayor's pale face bent over his gavel, striking again and again to restore order. But even he knew, power had shifted. The chair he sat on, once bolstered by Victor's shadow, now looked unsteady. Reporters pressed toward John, microphones aimed straight at his chest. Mr. Walker, how do you feel, now that the truth has finally come out? John swept his gaze across the faces before him, some skeptical, some admiring, some ashamed. He drew a deep breath, his voice low but steady. This is not my victory. This is the voice of those who drowned in that flood. Tonight, they were heard at last. Whose note? At first only a few claps. Then the sound spread, rolling through the hall until it was a thunder of hands. Daniel bowed his head, eyes wet. For the first time in his life, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. For years, he had carried the brand of being the son of a failure. Tonight, the whole town heard the truth. His father had not failed. His father had been silenced, and now his name was clean. Clara pressed through the crowd and embraced them both, whispering, "You did it. This town will never be the same again." Tears glistened in her eyes. Outside, neighbors gathered, faces John knew well, faces that had once looked away, now meeting his with nods, handshakes. An old man gripped John's hand, voice quivering. "I lost my granddaughter in that flood. Today, thank you." John squeezed the frail hand, and in that moment, it felt as though a stone marker had finally been laid for the souls swept away long ago. By evening, the group stepped out of the town hall. The square was packed, but this was no mob of fear. It was a gathering of people searching for hope. Daniel walked straighter than before, each step surer. His eyes no longer wandered, they were fixed ahead. John limped beside him, cane striking firm against the pavement, no longer just a crutch but a drumbeat of resolve. Whispers followed. Walker, the soldier. No longer jeering, but laced with respect. That night, back at Clara's cabin, John sat by the window staring into the dark. The fire burned low, its glow painting his face in a mix of weariness and peace. He knew the battle wasn't over. Courts would come. Other hands, stained by Victor's money, would still resist. But for the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself a long breath, let the heaviness slip. The silence was no longer, only grief. Daniel sat nearby. The letter from his father opened once again. He read slowly, carving every word into memory. Then he lifted his eyes, voice quiet but certain. "Justice doesn't end here. We'll keep going, won't we?" John looked at him, and a rare smile bent his scarred face. "Yes, but tonight, we won one fight." Outside, the mountain wind carried the damp scent of earth, but laced with it was something lighter, the faint fragrance of change. And in the heart of that small town, a new season had begun, not Victor Hale's season of fear, but a season of people who had learned, at last, to look truth in the eye. In the days after Victor's arrest, the town felt like it had shed an old skin. The wary glances, the whispered rumors behind backs, all seemed to fade. In their place came hesitant nods, cautious handshakes that, though awkward, carried real sincerity. John Walker walked down the main street, his cane tapping steady against the pavement, each echo carrying the weight of change. For decades, he had marched from one battlefield to another, from sand-choked bunkers in the Middle East to long, silent nights in his mountain cabin. Yet now he understood. The greatest battle of his life had not been fought under fire, but here at home, to defend truth and restore the dignity of those drowned and forgotten. Daniel walked beside him, the marks of hardship still etched into his young face, but his eyes calmer, brighter. In his hands was his father's old notebook, its yellowed pages now a guiding lantern. "John," he whispered, "I've thought long about this. Victor's blood runs in my veins, but I won't follow his path. I choose differently. I want us to build a memorial, so the people will remember those who were lost." His voice trembled, but the words were firm, like an oath. John stopped, turned, and studied him. In the old soldier's eyes flickered, for the first time, a quiet spark of trust. He nodded, his calloused hand pressing firmly to Daniel's shoulder. "That's the right choice. No man can choose his blood, but every man can choose the legacy he leaves." The memorial began on an empty patch of ground by the riverbank, the very spot where the water had once torn lives away. They raised the first wooden frames, then stone by stone, small markers engraved with names of the dead. Slowly, townsfolk came to help. One brought cement, another dug foundations, an old woman carried bread and hot coffee. The town, long suffocated by fear and silence, began to breathe again. Every day John hobbled to the site. Though age and injury bent him, his hands still lifted beams, hammered nails. Sweat mixed with dust, but his heart felt lighter. With each strike of his hammer he seemed to hear echoes, the voices of lost comrades. The cries from that night of flood answered now not with silence, but with a wall of remembrance. Daniel's hands, once shaky from fear, grew steadier. He stood before the crowd, speaking of what the memorial meant. Not to sow hatred, but to remind that one mistake, one lie, could destroy a town, and that only truth could guard against its return. People listened, faces somber, eyes softening. In his words, John saw not a haunted boy, but a man stepping into his own, no longer chained to the shadow of the past. On the day of dedication, the sky cleared in rare brilliance. Sunlight poured across the riverbank, where a stone wall now stood, names carved deep, crowned with the words, "So that none shall be forgotten." John stood still, his eyes wet, his chest heavy with grief, yet eased by peace. Daniel laid wildflowers at the base, his fingers trembling as they brushed his father's name. He turned to John and whispered, "He would be proud." John nodded, drawing a long breath. For the first time in years, the weight lifted. No more need to prove, no more whispers gnawing at him. Only truth, carved into stone, and a promise that the next generation would keep it. When the ceremony ended, townsfolk lingered, speaking softly near the wall. Children chased each other in the grass, their laughter mixing with the river wind. John lowered himself onto a wooden bench, watching the current drift calm and steady, feeling a fragile but solid faith. The town had found its chance to live again, and he, a soldier who had spent half a lifetime in smoke and fire, had finally found a battle worthy of all he had left the battle to hold fast to truth, to make sure the dark never returned. This story reminds us that not all wars are fought with rifles and fire. Some are fought in holding to truth, in defending honor. Power and lies can cover the light for years, but justice finds its way back. Older men and women who have lived through upheaval know well. Survival is more than breath. It is the courage to stand on the right side. Truth may cost dearly, but it gives the peace that falsehood never can. And the greatest legacy we leave the next generation is not wealth, but the example of a life lived straight, no matter the burden.